Welcome to U.S. History to 1877. In this course, you will survey the major themes, events, and ideas of American history through Reconstruction.
I'm Jordan O'Connell, History and Government Instructor at Northeast Iowa Community College. This lecture distills a decade of my written notes taken from Alan Brinkley's The Unfinished Nation, The American Yawp, and our course-assigned OpenStax U.S. History textbook. This lecture focuses on surveillance, slave codes, and the refusal to stay enslaved. The core question is this: how did escape, revolt, literacy, and testimony show that enslaved people kept fighting bondage under surveillance? The core competency is to describe the variety of efforts by enslaved blacks to break their bondage in the New World. What does it reveal about a slave society when it needs patrols, passbooks, and literacy bans to function every day? By the early 19th century, American slavery had become more entrenched economically and more anxious politically. Planters expanded cotton production. Internal slave traders moved thousands of people from the Upper South to the Deep South, and slaveholding politicians defended bondage as property and order. Yet the system's daily operation revealed a different truth. Slavery did not sustain itself through planter confidence. It sustained itself through supervision, passes, patrols, whipping, legal restriction, and constant suspicion that enslaved people would flee, resist, communicate, or revolt. A society secure in its own legitimacy does not need this much surveillance. The routine presence of mounted patrols, nighttime searches, pass inspections, and punishment codes shows how much force slaveholders believed necessary to hold human beings in bondage. The contradiction between revolutionary liberty language and enslaved reality sharpened that pressure. Americans celebrated independence from Britain while denying millions any claim to self-ownership. Enslaved men and women heard the language too. Some used it in revolt planning, some measured it against the hypocrisy of the Republic. Others concentrated on survival, kinship, worship, sabotage, literacy, and escape because the structure of slavery left no safe path to formal redress. Resistance took many forms because the regime it confronted controlled movement, labor time, information, and violence. The wider Atlantic world made slaveholders more fearful. The Haitian Revolution began in 1791 in the French colony of Saint-Domingue and ended with the creation of Haiti as an independent black republic in 1804. White Americans watched the destruction of plantation rule there with dread. Enslaved and free black people across the hemisphere watched it with attention and, in many cases, hope. Haiti proved that enslaved people could overthrow masters, armies, and empires. The news traveled by sailors, newspapers, rumor, and official correspondence. Southern legislators did not need every detail to feel threatened. The possibility alone reshaped policy. At the same time, Eli Whitney's cotton gin and the opening of new lands after Indian dispossession helped make cotton slavery more profitable. Profit changed geography. Planters demanded labor for expanding cotton districts in Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. The domestic slave trade grew as traders bought enslaved people in the Chesapeake and sold them farther south and west. Families were broken apart. Auction markets and coffles turned forced migration into routine business. County courts, sheriffs, and legislatures protected those transactions. The law did not stand outside slavery. It organized and defended it. Slave codes tightened the environment in which resistance had to operate. Laws restricted assembly, especially at night. Enslaved people often needed written passes to travel off plantation grounds. Patrols inspected roads and cabins. Some states limited manumission. Others restricted or criminalized black literacy, especially after rebellion scares. Religious meetings could also come under suspicion if white authorities thought preaching encouraged collective organization. These measures show the regime's operating logic. Once movement, reading, and gathering can aid resistance, each becomes something the law tries to narrow. Enforcement worked through local offices as much as plantation discipline. County justices heard accusations, issued punishments, and recorded fines. Sheriffs and constables supported slave patrol activity. Jails held suspected runaways until owners reclaimed them. Newspaper advertisements described scars, skills, clothing, and speech patterns of fugitives with disturbing precision. Rewards encouraged white cooperation in recapture. The state and the market met directly in that paperwork of pursuit. Gabriel Prosser's planned uprising in 1800 near Richmond, Virginia, demonstrates how organized resistance depended on logistics. Gabriel was an enslaved blacksmith with mobility, skill, and contact across plantation lines. The plot relied on communication, gathering points, weapons, and timing. A violent storm disrupted movement, and informants revealed the plan before it could fully unfold. Virginia authorities responded with executions and harsher vigilance. The episode changed events because it showed how quickly slaveholders turned from fear to law. A failed revolt could still thicken the surveillance regime. Nat Turner's rebellion in Southampton County, Virginia in 1831 brought an even more dramatic response. Turner, an enslaved preacher, believed divine signs had called him to action. He and his followers killed dozens of white people before the revolt was suppressed. White militias and mobs answered with broad retaliation, killing many black people, including some not connected to the uprising. Virginia legislators then tightened restrictions on black preaching, literacy, movement, and assembly. Turner did not produce emancipation. He did reveal how quickly the state could expand coercion when masters believed the system had been pierced. Escape operated through a different set of methods. Enslaved people stole time, forged passes, used waterways, hid in wagons, moved through woods at night, or relied on free black communities and anti-slavery allies. Harriet Tubman later became the most famous conductor associated with the Underground Railroad, returning repeatedly into slave territory to guide others north. Her activity belongs slightly later than some of the early Republic events already under discussion, but it illustrates the structure already forming: secrecy, coded communication, trusted households, and improvised routes. The law tried to immobilize enslaved people. Escape networks answered by turning mobility into resistance. Daily resistance was more common than open revolt because the costs were lower and the opportunities more frequent. Work slowdowns, tool breaking, feigned illness, theft of food, maintenance of family ties across plantations, and preservation of African-derived worship and music all fit within this pattern. Spirituals carried grief, hope, biblical language, and sometimes practical information. Free black communities built churches, schools, burial societies, and aid networks under hostile laws. These institutions changed events because they preserved dignity and circulated information outside the master's script. Frederick Douglass, writing later in his 1845 narrative about his earlier life in slavery, supplies testimony that helps explain the whole system. He described whipping, hunger, calculation by overseers, and the intense struggle over literacy. Learning to read did not free him at once, but it made the regime's claims harder to accept. Douglass also described his fight with Edward Covey as a moment in which self-possession reemerged under conditions designed to crush it. His narrative joins the world of daily surveillance to the world of intellectual resistance. Free black communities added another pressure point because they complicated slaveholder claims that black dependence was natural. In northern cities and some southern towns, free black artisans, sailors, ministers, and teachers built churches and mutual aid societies. Those institutions could shelter fugitives, pass along work information, gather funds, or help reconnect separated kin. White officials often viewed them with suspicion for that reason. Charity, worship, and resistance could overlap in the same room. Maritime labor widened those channels. Black sailors moved through ports such as Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, and Charleston, carrying news, abolitionist print, wages, and escape information along routes that local patrols could never fully seal. Court records, jail fees, and runaway advertisements added another layer to that coercive system, turning pursuit and punishment into ordinary county business. Douglass's narrative is the central source because it exposes slavery from below and from inside the machinery. One of his most quoted insights appears when he recalls his master's warning that education would forever unfit him to be a slave. The sentence is revealing because it comes from the slaveholder's side. Reading threatened the system because it widened comparison, memory, religion, planning, and self-definition. A literate enslaved person might understand a pass, forge a paper, interpret a newspaper, or read abolitionist argument. Literacy turned interior thought into practical danger for the regime. Douglass also demonstrates that violence in slavery was administrative, not exceptional. Whipping by Edward Covey, food deprivation, exhaustion, and constant intimidation were methods of labor management. The narrative therefore shows why resistance took so many forms. If the system attacked body, family, faith, and mind at once, then resistance could appear as revolt, escape, reading, worship, or refusal to surrender inner judgment. The source is useful precisely because it does not romanticize the process. Douglass presents fear, calculation, and pain alongside resolve. The same source allows comparison with legal response after Gabriel and Turner. Slaveholders claimed that slavery was orderly and natural, yet they feared books, sermons, movement, and communication. Douglass confirms why. Bondage required ignorance to look stable. Once knowledge circulated, the contradiction became harder to control. Douglass also helps connect open resistance to daily resistance. His narrative records tricks used by slaveholders to control rations, manipulate time, and keep laborers exhausted, yet it also records moments when enslaved people compared experiences and passed fragments of knowledge to one another. Those small exchanges preserved collective understanding under conditions designed to prevent it. The consequence of enslaved resistance was not immediate liberation within the early republic. The more immediate consequence was exposure. Each plot, rebellion, escape, and testimony showed how much force slavery required to keep operating. Legislatures answered by tightening slave codes. Patrol systems expanded, literacy restrictions grew more severe in some states. White churches and officials watched black religious meetings more closely. The interstate slave trade deepened family rupture while still failing to eliminate resistance. Slaveholders kept trying to isolate people from one another because collective knowledge made the system less governable. Resistance also reshaped anti-slavery thought. Douglas's narrative, free black institution building, and the memory of Gabriel, Haiti, and Turner all supplied evidence that enslaved people were political actors rather than passive victims. That evidence later strengthened abolitionists, but it first circulated inside slave communities themselves. Families preserved names, kin ties, worship, and stories because memory resisted ownership. Daily survival and open revolt belonged on the same continuum of refusal. The record of repression after rebellion scares makes that continuum even clearer. After Turner's revolt, legislatures debated colonization, emancipation, and tighter police controls, then moved mainly towards stricter surveillance. After Gabriel's plot, interrogations and executions spread fear across Virginia. These responses show that slaveholders read revolt as a structural threat, not a random event. They recognize that the labor system itself produced organized opposition. Runaway notices make the contradiction especially visible. Owners described age, complexion, accent, scars, trades, relatives, and likely destinations because they knew enslaved people possessed memory, skill, and social intelligence. A boatman, carpenter, or blacksmith could travel farther and hide more effectively than planters like to admit. The advertisement itself became proof that enslaved people were active decision-makers inside a system built to deny that fact. That is why resistance belongs at the center of the early republic story. The same nation that wrote constitutions, celebrated elections, and praised liberty also financed patrols, maintained slave jails, and paid rewards for recapture. Enslaved resistance forced those facts into the open repeatedly by making the security machinery visible. Some resistance never appeared in court records or newspapers at all. Parents taught children names and kin ties that sale could not erase. Couples sought ways to preserve marriages across plantations. Enslaved workers carried food, tools, and messages between cabins and neighboring properties. These acts did not overthrow slavery, but they kept human claims alive inside a system built to reduce people to inventory. Religious gatherings added another layer. A prayer meeting might offer comfort, but it could also preserve news, kin ties, and collective memory. That is one reason white officials so often watched black worship with suspicion and tried to regulate who could preach. Memory itself became a form of resistance when law treated family ties as disposable. The unresolved judgment remains severe. How should a society's liberty language be measured when that same society needs patrols, pass books, literacy bans, and retaliatory law to hold millions in bondage? The answer cannot rest in patriotic abstraction. The operational facts decide the judgment. Slavery survived through paperwork, patrol routes, county enforcement, and violence. Resistance survived through roads, rumors, songs, kin, stolen time, forged movement, revolt planning, and testimony. Both systems were organized. Only one claimed to be the guardian of freedom. The patrols, pass systems, and literacy bans settle one point. Slavery required daily force because enslaved people kept asserting humanity within it. The harder judgment is how a republic that praised liberty measured itself while needing that machinery to preserve property. One side claimed order. The other kept proving that order had to be beaten into existence.
If you're curious how I'm using AI to build these lectures and reshape higher education, visit thelibertytolearn.com. I'll see you in class.